So in the first reading and the second reading, the gospel I should say, we have a contrast. We have Peter working miracles and people in abundance coming to believe in the Lord. Peter, disciple, apostle of Jesus Christ. And then we have in the gospel Jesus Christ himself, the master. And instead of people coming to believe, people leaving him. And this is the only occasion where we hear about disciples leaving Jesus. And not just some disciples, many disciples leave Jesus. This is intolerable language, they say. How could anyone accept it? And they can't accept it, and therefore they leave. What can they not accept? At the beginning of John's Gospel, of chapter 6, Jesus works this miracle of the multiplication of loaves. Then he teaches them about believing in him and having faith in him leading to eternal life. And the whole metaphor of bread, eating bread and feeding on this bread of life is about believing in Jesus. That's what the text is speaking about. It's an invitation to believe initially, all the way up to verse 51. That's what it is. It's an invitation to believe. If you believe in me, you will have eternal life. And then in verse 51, it changes, where Jesus goes from the metaphor to the real, to the literal. And he's saying, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you cannot have life. And those who are listening to him and his disciples who are following him hear that, and they understand that he is not speaking metaphorically anymore. He's speaking literally. You have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. So much so that they ask this question. We heard it yesterday. How can this man give us his flesh to eat? How can he do that? They understand him very, very clearly. And Jesus, instead of correcting a misunderstanding, you've taken me literally. I didn't mean it literally. I'm talking symbolically, metaphorically. This is what I'm talking about. No, he doesn't do that. He reinforces that he expects his disciples to eat his flesh and drink his blood. He doesn't say how. How can this man give us his flesh and blood to eat? He doesn't say how. That will come later. And so he goes on, and it reinforces the need to actually bite into his flesh and to drink his blood. So much so that now they're saying, we cannot take this. And many of them leave. And Jesus, again, if there's a misunderstanding, and John's Gospel often uses misunderstandings for Jesus to continue to teach and to correct their misunderstanding. But he doesn't correct their misunderstanding because they have not misunderstood. And so when they say this is intolerable language, he says, does that upset you? Instead of saying, no, you've got it wrong, does that upset you? Well, what if you should see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before, speaking about his ascension into heaven? And then he goes on to speak about the Spirit and the flesh. And Jesus is the giver of the Spirit who is life, the water of life. And here, so he speaks about the Spirit that gives life, the flesh has nothing to offer. And here he's not speaking about the flesh as it was, eat my flesh and drink my blood. Here he's speaking about the flesh which is the material, just the rational, apart from faith. At the beginning, they're looking for, the people are thinking in a very fleshy way, very rational way. We want food to fill our bellies. And they're not thinking of the spiritual, they're not thinking of the greater things, they're not thinking of the life of God. And so the flesh has nothing to offer. It is the Spirit that gives life. And these people, Jesus does not correct, he just reinforces. And so they walk. They refuse to accept this teaching that he will give his flesh as food for eternal life, his blood as food for eternal life. And then he turns to those who are left, the apostles. Are you going to leave me too? And here Peter gives his profession of faith. He's given it in Matthew's Gospel. If you remember in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus says, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And here Peter makes his profession in John's Gospel. "Lord, to whom shall we go?" he says. "You have the message of eternal life, and we believe. We know that you are the Holy One of God." We believe. And it is in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus says, "It is not flesh and blood that reveals this to you." It's not flesh. The flesh has nothing to offer, says St. John here. "It is not flesh and blood that reveals this, but my Father in heaven." And here Jesus has said, "No one comes to me unless the Father allows him." Peter has faith. He does not understand this teaching. There's no way he can understand it. But he believes in Jesus. These days, many of us want to understand before we believe. But that's not actually the way it works. We believe in order to understand, says St. Anselm. And why do we believe? We know that you have the message of eternal life. We know that you are the Messiah. We know that you are the Holy One of God. You are the truth. Because you are God, Lord, and you cannot say anything but the truth. If you say it, it is true. And so we make the submission of our intellect. I do not understand, but Lord, because you are saying it, I believe it. I accept it. I don't understand it. Lord, give me the grace to understand. But it is you who is saying it, so I believe, Lord. Now, Jesus was able to say that to, Peter was able to say that to Jesus. Jesus was in front of him. He believed. And Jesus still teaches us today. And we can still make that same act of faith that Jesus did, that we can make the same submission of our intellect, and we should make that submission of our intellect even today, because Jesus still teaches us. He teaches us through the church. He said in Matthew's Gospel 16, "Whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth is loosed in heaven." When they hear you, they hear me. And so you and I might not be able to understand all the teachings of the church. We might not be able to understand fully this great gift that we've received or other areas of teaching in the church. And we might hear the voices of those around us, the many who didn't want to believe this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? And how many times have we heard that said about the teachings of the church? And we might not understand it fully. But like Peter and like the apostles, we're called to make the submission of our intellect. Lord, I don't understand this. I don't understand your teaching fully. But because you say it, Lord, I believe it. Because you are God, you are truth, and from you there can be no lie. Lord, I accept. And I ask for the grace to understand. And it's only afterwards that they'll come to understand that Jesus will give his flesh, for the life of the world, will pour out his blood for the life of the world. Only afterwards will they come to understand, will we come to understand that this event and this event are the same event. One bloody, one unbloody. And it is here that we're to eat the flesh and drink the blood of the living God.